In 1989, a physicist stepped out of the shadows and told the world something that seemed impossible. He claimed he had worked on alien spacecraft at a secret facility in the Nevada desert. His name was Bob Lazar, and what happened next would change everything we thought we knew about government secrecy, scientific credibility, and the price of telling the truth. But here's what nobody talks about. The real story isn't just about flying saucers. It's about how institutions erase people who speak out, how whistleblowers are systematically discredited, and how one journalist risked everything to expose a pattern of suppression that goes far beyond UFOs. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why Lazar's story matters, even if you don't believe a single word about aliens, because what happened to him reveals something deeply disturbing about how truth is controlled in America. The year 1989 marked a turning point in how the public understood government secrecy. When Bob Lazar appeared on Las Vegas television, initially disguised and using the pseudonym Dennis, he did more than share an outlandish story about extraterrestrial technology. He exposed the machinery of institutional denial, the systematic erasure of records, and the weaponization of credibility itself. This isn't just a UFO story, it's a case study in how modern institutions protect secrets and what happens to those who dare to challenge the official narrative. To truly understand what happened with Bob Lazar, we need to examine the psychology of who becomes a whistleblower and why. Lazar was never a conformist. From his earliest days, he exhibited the characteristics of someone who lives at the boundaries of convention. He wasn't content with textbooks and traditional education. He built particle accelerators in his garage, strapped jet engines to Honda Civics, and constantly pushed against the limits of what was considered safe or acceptable. This personality type, the restless experimentalist who values discovery over approval, is exactly the kind of person who institutions both need and fear. The contradiction in Lazar's background is central to understanding his story. He appeared in Los Alamos National Laboratory directories. A local newspaper photographed him with his jet car, identifying him as a laboratory physicist. People who worked there remembered him. Yet when researchers and journalists later investigated, official records denied his employment. His claimed degrees from MIT and Caltech could not be verified. No transcripts, no enrollment records, no evidence he had ever attended these prestigious institutions. This creates a fascinating psychological puzzle. Either Lazar fabricated an elaborate educational history to give himself credibility, or someone went to extraordinary lengths to erase his past. The erasure hypothesis is worth examining seriously, not because it's necessarily true, but because it fits a documented pattern. Throughout history, when individuals with security clearances have breached classified information, governments have employed various methods to discredit them. The most effective method isn't to silence someone directly, which creates martyrs and conspiracy theories. Instead, you attack their credibility at its foundation. You remove the evidence that they were ever qualified to know what they claim to know. You make it impossible for them to prove they were ever in a position to witness what they describe. This isn't speculation. Declassified documents from various intelligence agencies show this exact tactic being used repeatedly throughout the Cold War and beyond. What makes Lazar particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is his consistency. Over more than 30 decades, through countless interviews, documentaries, podcast appearances, and public scrutiny, his story has remained fundamentally unchanged. He describes the same facility, the same craft, the same propulsion systems, the same experiences. This consistency is unusual. Most people who fabricate stories tend to embellish over time, adding details to make the narrative more compelling or adjusting elements that have been challenged. Lazar has done neither. He tells the same story in the same matter-of-fact tone, often seeming reluctant to discuss it at all. This reluctance is itself revealing. People who seek attention through fabricated stories typically embrace the spotlight. They write books, build brands, monetize their claims. Lazar withdrew. He runs a scientific supply company, rarely gives interviews, and has repeatedly stated he regrets ever coming forward. This behavior pattern doesn't fit the profile of attention-seeking hoaxer. It fits the profile of someone who felt compelled to speak about something deeply troubling, paid a severe price for doing so, and now wishes they could take it back. The question of Lazar's credibility cannot be separated from the question of institutional power. If you accept that governments possess information they consider too sensitive or disruptive to reveal, then you must also accept that they possess mechanisms to protect that information. These mechanisms wouldn't just involve securing physical facilities and documents, they would involve securing people, ensuring that those who know secrets either stay silent or, if they speak, cannot be believed. The erasure of Lazar's background, whether deliberate or simply the result of his own fabrications, serves the same function either way. It makes him unprovable.
To understand whether Lazar's story could be true, we need to understand how classified programs actually work. The United States government operates on a principle called compartmentalization. This means that even people working on the same project often don't know what others are doing. You're given access only to the specific information you need to complete your assigned task. This isn't paranoia, it's operational security. If someone is compromised, captured, or decides to leak information, they can only reveal what they personally knew. The facility Lazar described, which he called S4, supposedly existed south of the main Area 51 base at Groom Lake. The description he provided matches exactly how such a facility would be designed if it needed to remain completely hidden. Hangar doors built at an angle into hillsides, appearing from the air as natural rock formations. This isn't science fiction. Similar camouflage techniques have been documented at various military installations around the world. During World War II, entire aircraft factories were disguised to look like residential neighborhoods from above. The principle is the same. If you want to hide something significant, you don't build an obvious structure, you integrate it into the natural landscape. The security procedures Lazar described also match documented protocols for highly classified programs. The Janet flights, the unmarked planes with red stripes that ferry cleared personnel from Las Vegas to Groom Lake, are real. They've been photographed, tracked, and confirmed by aviation journalists. The intense background checks, polygraphs, and invasive questioning Lazar described are standard for positions requiring top-secret clearances, particularly those involving compartmented information. The escort procedures, the restricted movement, the constant surveillance, all of these elements align with how classified facilities actually operate. What's particularly interesting is how Lazar described the compartmentalization within S4 itself. He said he was assigned to work on propulsion systems for one specific craft, but observed that other teams were working on different aspects: navigation, materials analysis, potentially biological studies. He claimed he was deliberately kept in the dark about the larger program. This is exactly how such a project would be structured. You minimize risk by ensuring that no single person can compromise the entire operation. Each person becomes a fragment of knowledge, unable to see the complete picture. The question isn't whether facilities like the one Lazar described could exist. We know they can. We know the government operates secret programs that remain classified for decades. What we learned about the SR-71 Blackbird, the U-2 spy plane, and stealth technology only came to light years or even decades after these programs were operational. Groom Lake itself was a rumor for years before it was officially acknowledged. The existence of highly classified aerospace programs isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented history. The real question is what these programs are researching. Are they studying human-built experimental aircraft, pushing the boundaries of conventional technology? Or are they, as Lazar claimed, attempting to reverse engineer technology from somewhere else? This question cannot be answered with the information available to the public. But the architecture of secrecy that would be required to study either type of technology would look exactly the same. Hidden facilities, compartmentalized knowledge, erased records, denied access, and aggressive discrediting of anyone who speaks out.
One of the most compelling and controversial aspects of Lazar's testimony involves his description of the fuel source for the craft he claimed to study. He called it Element 115. At the time Lazar first spoke publicly in 1989, Element 115 did not exist on the periodic table. The heaviest confirmed element was much lower. To many scientists and skeptics, this claim was proof that Lazar was making things up. Element 115 sounded like something from science fiction, a convenient placeholder for technology he couldn't otherwise explain. Then, something remarkable happened. In 2003, nearly 15 years after Lazar first mentioned element 115, scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, Russia, successfully synthesized it. They created it by bombarding americium with calcium ions. The element existed for only fractions of a second before decaying, but it existed. It was eventually named Moscovium and officially added to the periodic table in 2016. Suddenly, something Lazar had spoken about in 1989, something that was ridiculed as impossible fantasy, was real. The skeptical response to this development is worth examining. Critics argue that Lazar simply made an educated guess. If you understand how the periodic table works, you know that heavier elements beyond those naturally occurring on Earth could theoretically be created in laboratories. Predicting that element 115 would eventually be synthesized isn't particularly bold, it's just extending the pattern. Furthermore, the Moscovium that scientists created is wildly unstable, lasting only milliseconds before decaying into lighter elements. It bears no resemblance to the stable, metallic substance Lazar described being used as spacecraft fuel at S4. But the believer's response is equally compelling. If Lazar was simply guessing about future scientific discoveries, why would he specifically choose element 115? Why not element 116 or 120 or any other number? Why describe its properties in such detail, claiming it produced gravitational effects when bombarded with protons? The specificity of his claim, made over a decade before the element was even created in any form, is striking. It suggests he either had remarkable intuition about nuclear physics, or he was describing something he had actually encountered.
The real significance of the element 115 situation isn't about proving or disproving Lazar. It's about how we evaluate extraordinary claims. When someone makes a specific, testable prediction about future scientific discoveries, and that prediction comes partially true, how should we respond? Do we dismiss it as coincidence? Do we acknowledge it as evidence of possible inside knowledge? The scientific method would suggest we remain open to evidence while maintaining skepticism. The problem is that in the court of public opinion, people tend to choose sides immediately and then interpret all new information through that lens. What Lazar described was not the unstable Moscovium created in laboratories. He described a stable isotope, a form of element 115 that could exist at room temperature, be machined into small disks, and serve as a power source when subjected to specific conditions. If such a stable isotope exists, it would require an understanding of nuclear physics beyond our current capabilities. It would suggest that someone, somewhere, had solved problems that our most advanced scientists still consider theoretical. This is where Lazar's story becomes either proof of extraordinary secret knowledge or proof of an elaborate hoax built on scientific speculation. The element 115 debate encapsulates the larger challenge of evaluating Lazar's testimony. Every detail he provided can be interpreted two ways. Either he's describing something real that he witnessed, or he's constructed a clever story using just enough real science to sound plausible while remaining conveniently unprovable. The fact that one of his most ridiculed claims, the existence of element 115, later became scientific fact adds a layer of complexity that neither supporters nor skeptics can fully explain away.
None of Bob Lazar's story would have reached the scale it did without George Knapp. This is crucial to understand. Knapp wasn't a UFO enthusiast or a fringe journalist chasing sensational stories. He was an Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter with a solid reputation in mainstream journalism. He had built his career on exposing political corruption and institutional malfeasance. He was the kind of journalist who demanded evidence, who cross-checked sources, who approached stories with professional skepticism. This made his decision to air Lazar's testimony remarkable and risky.
When Knapp first heard about Lazar through local researchers and UFO enthusiasts, his initial response was dismissive. UFO stories were career killers in serious journalism. They were the domain of tabloids and late-night radio shows, not Emmy-winning investigative reporters. But something about Lazar's story caught his attention. The specificity of the claims, the technical detail, the consistency of the testimony. These weren't characteristics of typical UFO witnesses who described vague lights in the sky. Lazar was describing precise locations, specific technologies, detailed procedures. He spoke like someone recounting actual experiences, not repeating rumors. Knapp's decision to investigate further was methodical. He didn't simply accept Lazar's word, he began gathering evidence. He tracked down the Los Alamos directory that listed Lazar's name. He found the newspaper photographs showing Lazar with his jet car, identified as a laboratory physicist. He interviewed people who remembered working with Lazar at Los Alamos. He collected pieces of documentation that supported at least parts of Lazar's background. This wasn't advocacy journalism, it was investigation. Knapp was building a case, testing whether the story could withstand scrutiny. The first broadcast in May 1989 was cautious. Knapp presented Lazar in silhouette, voice altered, using only the pseudonym Dennis. This protected Lazar's identity while allowing the story to be told. The response was immediate and intense. Phone lines at the television station lit up. Some callers were outraged, dismissing it as nonsense. Others expressed relief that someone was finally speaking about what they had long suspected. The story spread beyond Las Vegas within days, picked up by news outlets around the country. Area 51, previously known only to aviation enthusiasts and military historians, suddenly became a household name.
When Lazar decided to reveal his full identity days later, Knapp made the same choice. He would stand behind the story publicly. He would attach his name and reputation to one of the most controversial testimonies in modern history. This decision could have ended his career. Many colleagues in journalism thought he had made a catastrophic mistake. UFOs were considered professional suicide. By associating himself with Lazar, Knapp was risking everything he had built. But he believed the story was significant enough to justify the risk. Whether Lazar's claims were entirely true or not, they revealed something important about government secrecy and the suppression of information. What happened next demonstrated why journalist credibility matters. Because Knapp was a respected figure in mainstream journalism, Lazar's story couldn't be dismissed as easily as it might have been otherwise. When a tabloid publishes claims about alien spacecraft, it's ignored. When an Emmy-winning investigative reporter does it, people pay attention. News organizations that would never cover UFO stories found themselves covering the Lazar story because Knapp was involved. His credibility transferred, at least partially, to the testimony he was presenting. Knapp didn't stop with the initial broadcasts. He continued investigating for years. He interviewed Lazar's friends who had witnessed the desert test flights. He gathered their video footage, grainy and distant though it was. He documented the surveillance and intimidation Lazar reported experiencing after going public. He tracked down more evidence of Lazar's presence at Los Alamos, despite official denials. He built an archive of documentation that kept the story alive even when mainstream media moved on. This persistence transformed Knapp from a reporter covering a story into a chronicler of history. He became part of the narrative himself. The partnership between Lazar and Knapp created something neither could have achieved alone. Lazar had the testimony, but lacked the platform and credibility to be taken seriously. Knapp had the platform and credibility, but needed testimony significant enough to justify the professional risk. Together, they changed the landscape of UFO discourse. They moved the conversation from lights in the sky to questions of engineering and government secrecy. They made Area 51 a cultural symbol. They forced mainstream media to acknowledge, even if only to ridicule, the possibility that classified programs might be studying extraordinary technology. The Knapp factor demonstrates a crucial truth about how information spreads in society. The messenger matters as much as the message. An identical story told by different people will have vastly different impacts depending on their credibility, platform, and professional reputation. Lazar's claims might have remained local rumors known only to a small circle of UFO enthusiasts, but carried by Knapp,
A journalist whose professional integrity was established and respected, those claims reached millions. They sparked debates that continued decades later. They influenced popular culture, government policy discussions, and public perceptions of secrecy and disclosure.
What happened to Bob Lazar after he went public provides a textbook example of how institutions respond to whistleblowers who threaten to expose classified information. The pattern is consistent across numerous documented cases from various government agencies and classified programs. First, deny everything. Second, attack the whistleblower's credibility. Third, make it impossible to prove they were ever in a position to know what they claim to know. Lazar's experience fits this pattern precisely. The denial phase began immediately. Government spokesmen rejected Lazar's claims outright. They denied the existence of S4. They stated that no program existed to study recovered craft. They dismissed the entire testimony as fantasy. This is standard operating procedure. When classified information is leaked or threatened, the first response is always blanket denial. Confirm nothing, provide no details that could be verified or investigated further. The goal is to create a wall of official rejection that makes the whistleblower appear delusional or dishonest. The second phase, attacking credibility, focuses on the whistleblower's background and character. In Lazar's case, this centered on his education and employment history. Investigators searched for his academic records at MIT and Caltech and found nothing. No transcripts, no enrollment, no evidence he had attended these institutions. This absence became the primary weapon against his credibility. If he lied about his education, critics argued, why should anything else he said be believed? This is effective because it doesn't require proving that his specific claims about S4 are false. It simply makes him appear unreliable as a witness. The employment records present a more complex situation. Lazar appeared in a Los Alamos National Laboratory directory. A newspaper photograph from 1982 identified him as a laboratory physicist. People who worked there remembered him, yet when officially questioned, Los Alamos denied he had ever been employed. This contradiction is fascinating because it suggests either an extraordinarily thorough erasure of records or Lazar's presence was in some peripheral capacity that didn't constitute official employment. The directory listing and photograph prove he had some connection to the facility. The official denial proves that institutions can make inconvenient facts disappear from official records. The third phase involves making verification impossible. If records that once existed are removed, if colleagues are instructed not to confirm employment, if documentation is classified or destroyed, then the whistleblower cannot prove their claims even if those claims are true. This creates a perfect trap. The whistleblower knows what they experienced, but they cannot prove they were ever in a position to experience it. Skeptics can point to the absence of evidence as proof of fabrication, while supporters can point to the suspicious disappearance of records as proof of suppression.
Lazar also reported more active forms of intimidation. He described being followed, his phone lines tapped, his home broken into. He spoke of direct warnings about continuing to talk publicly. These reports are harder to verify because they involve clandestine activities that, by definition, leave little evidence, but they fit the pattern of how intelligence agencies have historically dealt with security breaches. Declassified documents show that during the Cold War, agencies routinely surveilled, harassed, and intimidated individuals suspected of leaking classified information. The effectiveness of this multi-layered response shouldn't be underestimated. By the time these mechanisms have been deployed, the whistleblower is thoroughly isolated. Their credibility is destroyed in mainstream discourse. They cannot prove their background. They cannot verify their employment. They cannot provide physical evidence of what they claim to have witnessed because that evidence is classified or locked away. They're left with nothing but their testimony, which skeptics dismiss as unverifiable and likely fabricated. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that it works whether the whistleblower is telling the truth or lying. If someone fabricates a story about working on classified programs, the absence of records proves their fraud. If someone actually worked on classified programs and had their records erased, the absence of records is used to prove their fraud. The mechanisms of discrediting function the same way in both scenarios. This is why the Lazar case remains unresolvable. Every piece of missing evidence can be interpreted as either proof of his dishonesty or proof of institutional suppression. The broader implications extend beyond UFOs and secret bases. This is how power protects itself. When someone threatens to expose information that powerful institutions want kept secret, those institutions have refined methods for neutralizing the threat without creating martyrs. You don't need to silence someone physically when you can silence them effectively by destroying their credibility. You don't need to confirm or deny their specific claims when you can make it impossible for them to prove they were ever in a position to make those claims. This is the architecture of institutional power in the information age. The decision by Bob Lazar to bring friends into the desert to witness test flights represents a crucial turning point in his story. It transformed his testimony from a single whistleblower's claims into a shared experience with independent witnesses. These night watches, as they came to be called, provided something UFO cases often lack: corroboration. Multiple people watching the same events, capturing them on camera, creating a record that extended beyond one person's word. But they also represented an escalation that would have serious consequences for Lazar. The logistics of these desert trips were carefully planned. Lazar knew when test flights were scheduled because he was working at the facility. He understood the flight patterns, the timing, and the locations where the craft could be observed from outside the restricted area. He selected spots along back roads and ridges where the airspace above Groom Lake was visible. He brought friends, including his wife, colleagues, and others who had expressed skepticism about his claims. The goal was to show them what he had described, to make believers out of doubters through direct observation. What these witnesses reported seeing is remarkably consistent across accounts. Luminous objects rising from the desert floor, moving in complete silence. Craft performing maneuvers that defied conventional physics, darting at right angles, hovering motionless, then accelerating instantaneously. No sound of engines, no exhaust trails, no visible means of propulsion. The objects would climb, perform impossible turns, and then descend back toward the facility. These weren't vague lights in the distance. The witnesses described structured craft close enough to observe details of movement and behavior. The video footage captured during these trips became some of the most widely circulated evidence associated with Lazar's claims. It's grainy, shaky, shot at night from a distance. The objects appear as bright points of light moving erratically. To believers, this footage shows exactly what Lazar described: advanced craft performing test flights over Area 51. To skeptics, it shows nothing conclusive. Distant lights could be flares, conventional aircraft, or any number of mundane explanations. The footage is frustratingly ambiguous, compelling enough to maintain interest, but unclear enough to avoid proving anything definitive. What makes the night watches significant isn't just the footage or the eyewitness accounts. It's the fact that Lazar took the risk of bringing civilians into a situation where they could observe classified activities. This was an enormous breach of security if his story is true. He was actively helping people witness tests of technology that was supposedly among the most closely guarded secrets in existence. This suggests either remarkable boldness or remarkable recklessness, depending on your perspective. It also suggests that Lazar felt the truth was important enough to risk the consequences. Those consequences came quickly. Lazar reported being spotted by security forces during one of these desert trips. Military patrols pursued them. He described tense moments trying to evade detection, knowing that being caught could mean not just the loss of his security clearance, but potentially criminal prosecution. The fact that he and his friends were able to observe the test flights from outside the restricted area exposed a vulnerability in the security apparatus around Groom Lake. If civilians with cameras could watch these flights, then the secrecy surrounding whatever was being tested was compromised. The broader UFO community quickly learned about these observations. Other enthusiasts and researchers began making their own trips into the Nevada desert, trying to replicate what Lazar and his friends had witnessed. This created a phenomenon that continues today. Area 51 became a destination for skywatchers, conspiracy theorists, and curious tourists. The lonely roads around Groom Lake filled with people pointing cameras at the sky, hoping to catch glimpses of extraordinary aircraft. The secrecy that had once surrounded the facility was fundamentally altered. You cannot keep a secret when crowds of people are gathered outside your fence, watching and recording. What's remarkable is that these independent observers, people who had never met Lazar and knew nothing about his specific claims, reported seeing similar phenomena. Lights moving in impossible ways, craft performing maneuvers no known aircraft could achieve, silent propulsion systems. These corroborating reports came from truck drivers, local residents, travelers passing through the area. They described experiences that matched what Lazar's group had witnessed, lending credibility to the claim that something unusual was indeed being tested in that airspace. The night watches represent the moment when Lazar's story moved from testimony to shared experience. They created a community of witnesses, each with their own observations and recordings. This community became self-sustaining. Even if Lazar had stopped talking entirely, the phenomenon he had pointed people toward continued to be observed and documented. The cat was out of the bag. The secret, if it was a secret, had been exposed, not through documents or insider leaks, but through simple observation. Sometimes the most powerful form of disclosure is just showing people where to look.
At the technical heart of Lazar's testimony lies his description of how the craft at S4 supposedly operated. This propulsion system, based on gravitational field manipulation, represents either a revolutionary breakthrough in physics or an elaborate fantasy built on misunderstood science. Understanding this distinction requires examining what Lazar actually claimed and comparing it to current scientific understanding. The result is complex, neither proving nor disproving his story, but revealing how advanced propulsion concepts exist at the boundary between cutting-edge theory and science fiction. Lazar described a reactor roughly the size of a basketball, powered by element 115, which produced a gravitational field when subjected to proton bombardment. This field was then focused and directed by 3 devices he called gravity amplifiers, arranged in a triangular configuration. By creating a distortion in space-time itself, the craft didn't push against air or expel mass for thrust. Instead, it fell into the gravitational distortion it created. This allowed for instantaneous acceleration, direction changes without inertia, and completely silent operation. The craft wasn't fighting physics, it was manipulating the fundamental fabric of space. The concept of manipulating gravity for propulsion isn't science fiction. It's speculative physics that serious scientists have explored. Einstein's general theory of relativity describes gravity not as a force, but as a curvature of space-time caused by mass and energy. If you could artificially create such curvature, you could theoretically create your own gravity field. This is the theoretical basis for concepts like the Alcubierre drive, a speculative method of faster-than-light travel that works by contracting space in front of a spacecraft and expanding it behind. You're not moving through space faster than light, you're moving space itself while remaining stationary within your local bubble. The problem is that these concepts require forms of energy and matter that we don't know how to create. The Alcubierre drive, for example, requires exotic matter with negative mass and energy density. No such matter has ever been observed or created in any laboratory. It exists only in mathematical equations. Lazar's description of element 115 producing gravitational effects faces similar challenges. According to our understanding of nuclear physics, simply bombarding an element with protons doesn't create gravitational fields. Gravitational effects are related to mass, not nuclear reactions. The mechanism Lazar described doesn't align with established physics. But here's where the argument becomes interesting. If you're attempting to reverse engineer technology from a civilization far more advanced than ours, you wouldn't expect it to operate according to principles we currently understand.
The entire point of studying such technology would be to discover new physics, new mechanisms, new ways of manipulating fundamental forces. If the propulsion system made perfect sense according to current human physics, it probably wouldn't be worth studying. The fact that Lazar struggled to explain it in conventional terms could mean either that he was making things up or that he was genuinely trying to describe something beyond his complete understanding.
Critics of Lazar point out inconsistencies in his technical descriptions. He sometimes mixed terminology, oversimplified complex concepts, or described mechanisms in ways that don't align with rigorous physics. This is interpreted as evidence that he's a fraud, trying to sound knowledgeable without actually understanding the science. But supporters argue that these imperfections are exactly what you'd expect from someone with limited access, trying to describe something they were only partially briefed on. Remember, Lazar claimed to be compartmentalized, given access only to specific aspects of the propulsion system, not the complete picture. His incomplete understanding could be authentic rather than fabricated. The broader question is whether the maneuvers Lazar described are actually possible. And here, recent developments become relevant. Navy pilots and military personnel have, in recent years, described encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena that perform exactly the kinds of maneuvers Lazar talked about decades earlier. Instant acceleration from hover to hypersonic speeds, right-angle turns at velocities that should tear any conventional aircraft apart, complete silence, no visible propulsion systems. These reports come from trained observers using advanced tracking equipment, not random witnesses with blurry cameras. The Pentagon has acknowledged these encounters and admitted they cannot explain them with current technology. This doesn't prove Lazar was telling the truth. The Pentagon reports don't mention S4 or Element 115 or gravity amplifiers, but they confirm that craft displaying the performance characteristics Lazar described do exist and are being encountered by military personnel. Either these are advanced human technologies from classified programs that remain secret even from most military personnel, or there's something else entirely. Either possibility suggests that propulsion systems far beyond publicly known capabilities are operational somewhere. The propulsion question ultimately comes down to what you're willing to accept as possible. If you believe that only technology we currently understand can exist, then Lazar's descriptions must be fantasy. But if you accept that our current understanding of physics is incomplete, that civilizations with thousands or millions of years more development might have discovered principles we haven't, then his descriptions become plausible. The truth is that we don't know enough to rule it out conclusively. Theoretical physicists regularly explore concepts that seem like science fiction. The difference between speculation and discovery is often just evidence, and evidence in classified programs is precisely what the public isn't allowed to see.
To fully understand the significance of Bob Lazar's testimony, we need to place it within the broader context of how government acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena has evolved over the past 75 years. Lazar didn't emerge in a vacuum. His story sits at a crucial juncture in a long history of official denial, gradual disclosure, and shifting public attitudes toward the UFO phenomenon. Understanding this context reveals why his testimony resonated so powerfully and why it continues to matter even today. The modern UFO era began in 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Roswell incident. Almost immediately, the government established patterns of response that would continue for decades: deny, explain away, ridicule. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, collected thousands of reports over 22 years, but consistently concluded that there was nothing extraordinary occurring. Most sightings were misidentifications, weather phenomena, or hoaxes. The small percentage that couldn't be explained were simply insufficient evidence for any extraordinary conclusion. The program was shut down in 1969 with an official statement that UFOs posed no threat to national security and represented nothing worth further investigation. But that wasn't the complete truth. Declassified documents from projects before Blue Book, like Project Sign and Project Grudge, show that military and intelligence officials took the phenomenon seriously. Early estimates suggested that some observed craft might be interplanetary in origin. These conclusions were quickly suppressed, replaced with more mundane explanations. The pattern was consistent. Whatever the phenomenon actually was, the official position would be that it was nothing extraordinary. This policy of dismissal and ridicule was effective. It made serious investigation of UFOs professional suicide for scientists and career-ending for military personnel who spoke openly about their experiences. Lazar appeared at a moment when this official policy was beginning to crack. By the late 1980s, thousands of credible witnesses had come forward. Military pilots, commercial airline crews, law enforcement officers, technical personnel. The weight of testimony was becoming impossible to dismiss entirely. Yet the official policy remained unchanged. Deny everything, acknowledge nothing, maintain the wall of ridicule. Lazar's testimony was significant because it didn't come from a civilian who saw lights in the sky. It claimed to come from inside the very programs that were supposedly studying this phenomenon. He was asserting that the government knew exactly what UFOs were because they had some and were attempting to understand how they worked. The timing of Lazar's revelation was crucial. In 1989, the Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall fell that November. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The justifications for extreme secrecy that had dominated for 40 years were becoming less compelling. Information that had been tightly controlled during the nuclear standoff was beginning to leak. Classified programs were being acknowledged. Former intelligence officials were writing memoirs. It was a moment of transition, and Lazar's story emerged right at that inflection point. This gave it resonance it might not have had at other times. Fast forward to recent developments, and the context has shifted dramatically. In 2017, the New York Times published articles revealing the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which had spent years studying UAPs. Videos from Navy fighter jets showing encounters with unidentified craft were released and acknowledged as genuine. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence delivered a report to Congress acknowledging that military personnel have encountered phenomena they cannot explain with current technology. Congressional hearings have been held. Whistleblowers with impressive credentials have come forward. The stigma around the subject is eroding. What's striking about this modern disclosure is how much of it echoes what Lazar described in 1989. The craft performing impossible maneuvers, the government programs studying them in secret, the attempts to understand propulsion systems that don't match known physics, the compartmentalization keeping even most military and intelligence personnel in the dark, the institutional denial even as evidence accumulates. Lazar described all of this 30 years before it began entering mainstream acknowledgement. Either he was extraordinarily prescient in fabricating a story that would later be validated by official reports, or he was describing something real that the government is only now beginning to admit might exist. The disclosure context also explains why Lazar's story never died. Unlike many UFO cases that fade from memory, his testimony kept resurfacing every time new information emerged about government UFO studies. When the A-tip revelation happened, journalists and researchers immediately connected it back to Lazar. When Navy pilots described tic-tac-shaped craft performing impossible maneuvers, people remembered Lazar describing similar disc-shaped craft doing the same things. When whistleblowers testified to Congress about crash retrieval programs, Lazar's claims about reverse engineering efforts at S4 gained renewed attention. His story became a reference point, a template that subsequent revelations seemed to partially confirm. This doesn't mean Lazar was entirely correct about everything. The official acknowledgments don't mention S4 specifically, don't confirm element 115 as fuel, don't validate his complete narrative, but they confirm enough of the framework that his testimony can no longer be dismissed as easily as it once was. The government does study UFOs. Programs do exist. Craft performing extraordinary maneuvers are real. Personnel with security clearances are involved. Compartmentalization keeps most people ignorant. These elements, which were ridiculed when Lazar first described them, are now officially acknowledged. The broader pattern suggests that disclosure isn't a single moment, it's a gradual process of acknowledgement happening in stages over decades. What is ridiculed in one era becomes speculation in the next and confirmed truth in the era after that. Lazar's testimony sits at an interesting position in this timeline, too early to be immediately validated, but too consistent with later revelations to be completely dismissed. He described a reality that the government is only now, 30 decades later, beginning to admit might exist. Whether he actually worked at S4 or not, he articulated a vision of government UFO programs that has proven remarkably accurate as more information has emerged. That accuracy is either the result of extraordinary fabrication skills or first-hand knowledge. The debate continues.
The influence of Bob Lazar's testimony extends far beyond UFO research circles. It fundamentally altered American popular culture, changed how people think about government secrecy, and created a cultural touchstone that continues to resonate decades later. Before Lazar, Area 51 was an obscure facility known primarily to aviation enthusiasts and military historians. After Lazar, it became one of the most famous locations in America, synonymous with aliens, secret technology, and government cover-ups. This transformation represents one of the most successful penetrations of classified information into popular consciousness in modern history. The phrase Area 51 barely existed in public discourse before 1989. Groom Lake was known, but it wasn't a household name. Lazar's testimony changed that overnight. Within weeks of his first broadcast, Area 51 became cultural shorthand for government secrecy about extraterrestrial matters. The term appeared in movies, television shows, books, and news articles. It became a punchline for late-night comedians and a serious topic for congressional hearings. This semantic shift is remarkable. Lazar and Knapp didn't just tell a story, they created a new vocabulary for discussing government secrets. The visual imagery Lazar described became embedded in popular culture. Hangar doors carved into hillsides, disc-shaped craft resting in clean industrial facilities, scientists in white coats attempting to understand alien technology. These images appeared in countless films and television shows. The X-Files, which premiered in 1993, drew heavily from Lazar's narrative framework. Independence Day, one of the highest-grossing films of the 1990s, featured Area 51 as a crucial plot location, where recovered alien craft were studied. Stargate, both the film and the television series, used similar concepts. The imagery spread so thoroughly that it became the default way popular culture depicted secret government UFO programs. This cultural saturation had a fascinating effect. It simultaneously validated Lazar's story to some audiences while making it seem cliched to others. Believers pointed out that popular culture kept returning to Lazar's descriptions because they rang true, because they matched a reality that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Skeptics argued the opposite, that Lazar had simply borrowed from science fiction and cultural expectations, and his story succeeded because it matched what people already wanted to believe. The cultural feedback loop made it increasingly difficult to separate Lazar's original testimony from the mountain of derivative content it inspired.
The impact on Area 51 itself was tangible. The lonely roads around Groom Lake became tourist destinations. Small towns like Rachel, Nevada, reinvented themselves as UFO tourism hubs. The Little A. Lee Inn, a modest restaurant and motel, became famous as the closest accommodation to the base. Entrepreneurs sold alien merchandise. Tour companies offered trips to the boundary of the restricted area. The military eventually had to deal with crowds of civilians watching their operations, something that would have been unimaginable before Lazar spoke out. The secret base was still secret in its operations, but its existence and location were now completely public knowledge. This forced the government into an awkward position. They could no longer completely deny that the facility existed. Satellite imagery made that impossible. Maps openly labeled it Area 51, a name the military had never officially used. The base became such a prominent cultural landmark that the CIA finally acknowledged its existence in 2013, decades after it had entered the popular vocabulary. This acknowledgement came in declassified documents about the U-2 spy plane program. The government could no longer maintain the fiction that Groom Lake was simply empty desert. The cultural impact extended into serious discourse as well. Before Lazar, most mainstream journalists wouldn't touch UFO stories. They were considered career suicide, the domain of tabloids and cranks. After Lazar, particularly after a respected journalist like George Knapp had validated the story enough to broadcast it, the subject gained marginal legitimacy. This didn't mean mainstream media embraced UFOs, but it meant they could no longer completely ignore them. When significant witnesses came forward, when official documents were released, when military encounters occurred, there was now a framework for reporting on it. Lazar had cracked open a door that could never be fully closed. The cultural impact extended into serious discourse as well. Before Lazar, most mainstream journalists wouldn't touch UFO stories. They were considered career suicide, the domain of tabloids and cranks. After Lazar, particularly after a respected journalist like George Knapp had validated the story enough to broadcast it, the subject gained marginal legitimacy. This didn't mean mainstream media embraced UFOs, but it meant they could no longer completely ignore them. When significant witnesses came forward, when official documents were released, when military encounters occurred, there was now a framework for reporting on it. Lazar had cracked open a door that could never be fully closed. The cultural impact extended into serious discourse as well.
More than 3 decades after Bob Lazar first appeared in shadow on Las Vegas television, his story remains unresolved. He has never been definitively proven truthful. He has never been definitively proven fraudulent. He exists in a liminal space between validation and debunking, a space that reveals as much about how we handle extraordinary claims as it does about the claims themselves. The Lazar phenomenon isn't really about whether alien spacecraft exist at Area 51. It's about how we evaluate evidence, how institutions control information, how truth becomes visible or remains hidden, and how one person's testimony can reshape cultural understanding regardless of whether it can be verified. The consistency of Lazar's story over decades is remarkable. He has given hundreds of interviews, appeared in numerous documentaries, and faced intense scrutiny from believers and skeptics alike. Through all of this, his core testimony has remained essentially unchanged. He describes the same facility, the same craft, the same technologies, the same experiences. He hasn't embellished to make the story more dramatic. He hasn't retreated from claims that proved controversial. He simply repeats the same account, often seeming reluctant to discuss it at all. This consistency is unusual enough to be significant, though its meaning remains contested. The absence of definitive evidence is equally remarkable. No photographs of the craft he described have emerged, no physical samples of element 115 in the stable form he claimed to have seen, no verifiable documents confirming his employment at S4. No other whistleblowers from the program have come forward to corroborate his specific claims. This absence allows skeptics to maintain that Lazar fabricated the entire story, but it also fits exactly the pattern you would expect if his story were true, and a sophisticated effort to suppress it had been undertaken. The lack of evidence proves nothing definitively either way. George Knapp's role in this enduring mystery cannot be overstated. By choosing to investigate and broadcast Lazar's claims, he gave them a legitimacy they would never have achieved otherwise. His continued investigation over decades, his documentation of supporting evidence, his reporting on subsequent developments in UAP disclosure, all of this has kept the Lazar story alive and relevant. Knapp transformed from a mainstream journalist taking a risk into a historian of the UFO phenomenon, and his credibility has provided a foundation that makes dismissing Lazar's testimony more difficult than it would otherwise be. The broader implications of the Lazar story extend into how we think about whistleblowers, institutional secrecy, and the public's right to know. If Lazar is telling the truth, it means the government has hidden the most significant discovery in human history for decades. It means that proof of extraterrestrial intelligence exists in secured facilities, studied by classified programs kept from humanity at large.
The justifications for such secrecy would be profound. The disruption to religion, philosophy, science, and geopolitics would be unprecedented. Perhaps such a secret is worth keeping, perhaps it isn't. But the decision about who gets to know would have been made without democratic input, without public discussion, by a small group of individuals operating in complete secrecy.
If Lazar is not telling the truth, the implications are different but still significant. It means that one person's testimony, carried by one journalist's credibility, reshaped American popular culture and influenced how millions of people understand government secrecy. It means that a carefully constructed story, built on just enough real science and just enough specific detail, can persist for decades without evidence. It demonstrates the power of narrative, the hunger for extraordinary explanations, and the difficulty of debunking claims that are designed to be unprovable. Either scenario reveals something important about how information, truth, and belief function in modern society. The Lazar story will likely never be fully resolved, unless the government releases comprehensive documentation about S4 and reverse engineering programs, or unless Lazar himself admits to fabrication. We are left with testimony that cannot be definitively proven or disproven. This irresolution is itself revealing. It shows the limits of verification when dealing with classified programs. It demonstrates how institutional power can make truth inaccessible even if it exists. It illustrates the permanent uncertainty that surrounds anyone who claims to have witnessed what they were never supposed to see. What we can say with certainty is that Bob Lazar changed the conversation. He gave specific form to vague suspicions. He provided technical detail to general speculation. He attached names and locations to rumors. Whether his story is true or false, he created a framework that influenced how Americans think about secret government programs, about Area 51, about the possibility that we are not alone. George Knapp ensured that this framework reached beyond fringe communities into mainstream consciousness. Together, they created a lasting impact that transcends the question of truth or fiction. The mystery endures. The debate continues. Bob Lazar remains a figure suspended between vindication and debunking, between hero and hoaxer. His story stands as one of the most extraordinary testimonies in UFO history and one of the most controversial. It reveals the mechanisms of secrecy and suppression. It demonstrates the power of consistent testimony and the limits of verification. It shows how one person, with one journalist willing to listen, can change how millions of people see the world. The desert keeps its secrets. The hangar doors, if they exist, remain closed. But the story Bob Lazar told has become part of our cultural fabric, a permanent fixture in how we imagine what might be hidden in the shadows of classified programs. And that impact, regardless of truth, is undeniable and enduring.